She was 7 years old, and they trained her to lie before they trained her to feel safe.
Eastern Washington dies in December. The blizzard comes down from the Cascades like something with a grudge, swallowing the highway 1 white mile at a time. No headlights ahead, none behind. Just the dark and the cold and the sound of a Harley Davidson pushing through weather that has no business being ridden in. Hank Dalton rode alone. He had been riding alone for 11 years, which was long enough that solitude had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like anatomy, like something he was built with. The Iron Saints patch on his back meant brothers when he needed them, which was almost never, and distance when he wanted it, which was almost always. The road asked nothing of him. The road just went. Highway 395 north of Spokane on Christmas Eve looked like the end of the world dressed up in holiday clothes. Snow on the pine trees, ice under the powder. The temperature had dropped 17 degrees in 4 hours and was still falling. Hank could feel it through his gloves, through his jacket, through the particular cold that a man accumulated when he rode long past the point where sensible people turned around. He was not going anywhere in particular. That was the honest truth of it. No family waiting, no table set, no children pulling at his sleeve asking if Santa had come yet. 11 years ago, there had been something resembling a life, the kind with an address and a woman who knew his coffee order and a dog that went crazy when he came through the door. He had walked away from all of it the same way he walked away from everything once it got close enough to matter. The road was easier. The road did not need anything from him that he could not give. He downshifted coming into a curve and felt the rear tire hunt for grip on black ice hiding under fresh powder. Found it, held. He leaned back into the straightaway and exhaled. The headlight cut a narrow tunnel through the storm. That was when he saw them. He almost missed it. A flash of color so wrong against the white that his brain registered it before his eyes properly had. He was past it in 2 seconds at highway speed, already braking, already feeling the bike slide as he pushed the rear wheel sideways to bleed velocity. The Harley fishtailed. Gravel and ice chewed at the tires. He came to a stop 40 yards down the road with his heart hammering and the engine still running. He sat for 1 second. 2. Then he killed the engine, put down the stand, and walked back through the dark. The railing along the highway's shoulder was bent where the snow had packed against it. Below the railing, maybe 4 feet down into the drainage ditch, was where he had seen the color. He came up to the railing and looked over, and the breath went out of him. 2 shoes, 1 pink, 1 white, attached to 2 feet, attached to a child. She was curled against the frozen embankment with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around herself, and she was not moving. 7 years old, maybe. The kind of small that stopped a man cold. She wore jeans and a light jacket that belonged to a warmer season, and her feet were in those mismatched shoes, and the shoes were soaked through and the snow had started to accumulate on her shoulder. Later, he would understand the shoes. She had dressed herself in total darkness, moving without sound, so the footsteps would not carry through the house. 1 pink shoe grabbed by feel, 1 white by accident. She had not stopped to correct it because stopping meant noise and noise meant being caught before she reached the road. A 7-year-old child had thought through every detail of her escape in the dark and had nearly made it. Hank was over the railing before he had consciously decided to move. He hit the ditch floor hard, knees sinking into frozen mud, and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, the way the Army had taught him a long time ago. The pulse was there, thin and rapid, and too fast, the pulse of a body burning everything it had left just to stay warm. Her lips were pale blue at the edges. Her fingers were curled inward. He got his jacket off in 5 seconds, wrapped her in it, lifted her against his chest. She weighed nothing. That was the part that stayed with him. The absolute nothing weight of a child who should have been home in warm pajamas listening for sleigh bells, and instead weighed nothing in his arms in a ditch on Christmas Eve. He carried her up the embankment one-handed and got back to the Harley and held her against his chest inside the open jacket and zipped it around both of them. Her heart beat against his ribs. Fragile, irregular, still there. He started the engine. May Holden operated it out of an unmarked space beneath a decommissioned meatpacking plant on the industrial edge of Spokane, the kind of address that did not appear in any directory and survived on word of mouth among people who could not afford questions from official medicine. She had been an Army field surgeon for 19 years before a series of decisions she never fully explained had resulted in her losing credentials. She never fully mourned. She was better at battlefield medicine than any credentialed physician Hank had ever encountered, and she kept the kind of hours that suggested sleep was something she considered optional. He called her from the highway with one hand on the bars. She picked up on the second ring. He said 3 words. Child, hypothermia, coming. She said 1. Hurry. The Harley screamed south through the blizzard with the girl pressed against Hank's chest. He could feel her breathing against his collarbone, shallow and too quick. He talked to her the way he had never been accustomed to talking, low and steady into the wind. Nothing words, just sound, just the human fact of another voice saying, you are not alone, because sometimes that was the only medicine that mattered before the real medicine started. The industrial district looked like a graveyard wrapped in snow. Empty loading docks, corrugated metal walls going orange with rust. A single security camera above a rolling steel door that watched the alley with the dead patience of something that had seen everything and stopped being surprised. Hank killed the headlight 50 yards out and coasted the last stretch in darkness. May was already at the door when he got there. 55 years old with gray hair pulled back tight, and the kind of eyes that assessed a situation before most people finished registering there was one. She took one look at the bundle against Hank's chest and turned without a word, and he followed her inside. The garage smelled like motor oil and antiseptic, and the particular human smell of a space where desperate things happen regularly. Fluorescent lights above a stainless steel table in the center of the room. IV bags hanging from ceiling hooks. A defibrillator on a rolling cart in the corner. Tool strips along the walls. Hank laid the girl on the table. May moved away. Good surgeons move quickly and without drama, snapping on gloves, reaching for her stethoscope, doing 3 things at once with the calm economy of someone who had performed this kind of work 1,000 times in worse conditions. She cut away the jacket with trauma shears and worked in silence. Then she stopped. Just for 1 second, just long enough for Hank to see her jaw tighten. She went back to work. Burn marks on both shoulders. Small, circular, the kind a cigarette made when held deliberately against skin. Old burns healed over, but not old enough. The left forearm, when May straightened it gently, was thickened and slightly crooked at the midpoint. Old fracture. Healed without setting. Healed wrong. She said without looking up, someone broke this bone and did not take her to a doctor. That was at least 8 months ago. Rope marks at both wrists, both ankles. Not fresh, not old. Recent enough that the skin was still tender. Hank stood on the other side of the table and watched and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was not going to make him want to put his fist through something, so he stayed quiet and let the anger sit in his chest like a coal and burn there steadily. May worked without drama. IV line inserted with the precision of someone who had done it in poor lighting under worse conditions. Bag of warm saline hanging. Thermal blankets from the cabinet by the wall wrapped carefully around the small body. Stethoscope to the chest. Pulse check at the wrist. Core temperature low. She said it the way a doctor said a fact that had weight, but not yet a verdict. Pulse stabilizing. She is going to need time and warmth and luck in that order. The rolling door at the back scraped open. Hank's hand dropped to the .45 at his hip. Then he heard the boots and recognized the stride, and his hand came away. Wes Keller walked in with Knox and Finn behind him. 3 men who filled a room without trying. Wes was 62 years old with a gray beard down to his chest, and the stillness that Gulf War veterans sometimes develop, the stillness of men who had been very close to very loud things and learned that silence was not emptiness, but the absence of unnecessary noise. He was the president of the Iron Saints. He was not Hank's superior in any way Hank recognized on a daily basis, but he was the closest thing to family that Hank had managed to keep. He looked at the table. He looked at the girl. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You did right bringing her here." That was all. He pulled a stool to the far wall and sat down and crossed his arms and watched. Knox and Finn stayed near the door. Knox was 6 feet 5 inches with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw and hands that could break things not designed to break. Finn was younger, mid-30s, both forearms dark with prison ink, a nose broken in enough places it had given up pointing in one direction. They were both looking at the table with the expression men wore when they understood immediately and completely what had been done to someone small. Nobody said anything for a while. Then the girl opened her eyes. It happened without warning. One moment she was still, and the next her eyes were open and wide, in the kind of dark that took in everything at once. Her breathing accelerated. Her hands found the edge of the table and gripped it. She looked at the fluorescent lights, and then at the motorcycles along the wall, and then at the large men near the door, and then at Hank. Hank moved before he thought about it. He pulled his stool close and sat down so he was below her eye level, so she was not looking up at him the way you looked up at something threatening. He put his hands flat on his knees, visible, empty. He did not reach for her. He did not lean in. He just sat there and let her look at him and gave her time to decide. She stared at him for a long time. Then she said in a voice that was barely a voice at all, flat and rehearsed and utterly mechanical, "I fell. That is what happened. I fell in the snow and I got lost." Hank did not move. He held her gaze. He did not challenge her, and he did not agree with her, and he did not act like he had not heard. He looked at the round burn marks on her shoulders. Then he looked back at her face. He said, "Who taught you to say that?" The girl went very still. She looked at him the way children looked at adults who had asked the right question, trying to calculate whether this was a test or a trap or something else. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table. Then she said, "He did." 4 seconds of silence. He did. Hank held those two words and turned them over and let them tell him what they were telling him. Not just that someone had hurt her, that was visible, but that someone had been deliberate enough, careful enough to prepare her, to script her, to practice with her until the lie came out flat and clean before the truth could surface. That was not the behavior of a man who hurt people in anger and regretted it later. That was the behavior of a man who managed his risk. The coal in Hank's chest burned hotter. He kept his face neutral. He said, "My name is Hank. You do not have to say anything right now. You can just rest." The girl watched him. Then she said, "He practiced with me. What to say if someone finds me? So they take me back." Hank said, "Nobody is taking you back anywhere tonight." She considered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned not to take assurances at face value. Then she said, "My name is Lily." May exhaled softly. Finn put his hand on the back of his neck and looked at the ceiling. Knox was very still. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up to her neck and felt for something under her neckline. A gold locket, small, the kind that came from a store that put more value on what went inside than on the metal itself. She held it in her palm and looked at it. Then she looked at Hank. She said, "My mom gave this to me before they took her." She opened it with her thumbnail. Inside was a photograph on one side, a woman with dark hair and a smile that had not yet learned to protect itself. On the other side, tucked behind a small square of padding, was a piece of paper folded to the size of a fingernail. She worked it free with careful fingers and held it out to Hank. He took it. He unfolded it with the care you use for things held together by faith alone. Inside, in handwriting that was small and precise and had clearly been written by someone who understood that space was limited, were 7 digits in 3 words. "When you are safe." Hank looked at the numbers, looked at Lily. She said, "She put it in there before the men came. She told me to keep it until I found someone who felt like safe. She said I would know." She looked at him with the directness children had before the world taught them to soften it. She said, "You feel like safe." Hank held the piece of paper and did not say anything for a moment. He had been called a lot of things in his life. Good at writing, good at keeping quiet, good at leaving before anyone started depending on him. No one had ever looked at him from a table in the middle of the night with 7 years of hard use on her small body and said, "You feel like safe." He said, "I am going to keep this safe for you. I promise." Lily nodded, like she had always known he would say that. Over the next 20 minutes in pieces, with long silences between them, Lily told him about Raymond Steele. She did not call him a monster. She talked about him the way a child talked about weather. He was there. He was what happened. He was the shape the world had taken, and there was no larger frame to put around it. Raymond Steele had appeared in their lives 3 years ago when Lily was 4. Her mother was Clara Donovan, and Lily described her with the precision of a child who had kept someone alive in memory for a long time. She smelled like vanilla. She sang at the sink when she thought nobody was listening. She read the same 3 books at bedtime every night because Lily always picked the same 3, and she never once acted tired of reading them. Steele had been polite at first. That was what Lily remembered most clearly, how polite he was, how he brought things and said the right words, and smiled with his whole face the way adults did when they wanted other adults to relax. Then one night, men came to the house, men in white coats with a piece of paper. Her mother had screamed. Lily had hidden in the closet and heard all of it, and it had never quite left her, the sound of her mother screaming behind a closed door, while men said calm, professional things in calm, professional voices. After that, Raymond Steele had papers, legal papers. He was the guardian now. He said her mother was sick. He said her mother was dangerous. He said Lily would understand when she was older. Lily said in that flat voice that she had never believed him. When she finished, Hank looked at the piece of paper with the 7 numbers on it. He said, "Does he know about this? About the phone number?" Lily shook her head. She said, "I kept it in the locket. He looked for something once. He said there was something hidden, and I told him it was just a picture. He looked, and the picture was there, and he stopped looking." She paused. "I had already moved the paper behind the backing. I learned that from a library book." Hank looked at her. 7 years old, library book. 3 years. He said, "She sounds smart, your mother." Lily said, "She is the smartest person I have ever known." She was going to prove something. That was what she was doing before they took her. She said some numbers were in the wrong places and she was going to fix it. Numbers in the wrong places. Hank filed that away. He said, "Rest now, I will be right here." He moved to the back of the garage and stood against the wall and took several slow breaths. His ribs ached from the cold. His hands were stiff. He heard the rolling door and did not turn until he heard Wes's boots on the concrete. Wes stood next to him. He said, "What do you need?" Hank said, "I need to know who Raymond Steele is." Wes had a phone to his ear before Hank finished the sentence. What came back over the next 40 minutes arrived in pieces from sources that did not appear on org charts. Raymond Steele, 52 years old, silver hair, charitable foundation bearing his name, ribbon cuttings at 3 hospitals, 2 schools, a veterans memorial in the last calendar year, board member at 2 financial institutions, photographed with the governor at a fundraiser 6 months prior, legal guardian of 1 minor female age 7, guardianship awarded 29 months ago following emergency psychiatric commitment of the biological mother. Commitment papers signed by Judge Harlan Ford of the Spokane County Family Court. All documentation clean, all paperwork in order. Biological mother Clara Donovan, age 38, currently a resident of Cascade Ridge Behavioral Institute, a private psychiatric facility 43 miles north of Spokane. No visitors permitted. No contact with outside parties. No state oversight. Private facility operating under a special licensing arrangement, not reviewed since its original approval. Hank's phone rang, unknown number. He stepped outside and answered. The voice was warm, educated, the kind of warmth that cost money to produce and was maintained with care. It said, "Mr. Dalton, my name is Raymond Steele. I believe there has been a misunderstanding this evening." Hank said nothing. The voice continued, "Lily has a condition, a psychiatric condition inherited from her mother. Tonight she had an episode and wandered from the property during the storm. I've been looking for her since 9 o'clock. Hank said, "How do you know my name?" A brief pause, the kind that was supposed to feel like consideration, but was actually calculation. The voice said, "I have resources, Mr. Dalton, people who help me keep track of things relevant to Lily's welfare. I appreciate what you did tonight. I genuinely do." Hank looked at the alley. Empty, snow falling. He said, "What do you want?" The voice said, "I want to come and collect my ward, and I want to have a conversation about how to make this evening disappear in a way that is beneficial for everyone involved. I am a reasonable man. I have significant legal resources, and I prefer not to use them on people who have done nothing more than a good turn in bad weather." Hank said, "I'm going to stop you there. I have seen what you call a psychiatric condition. It looks like cigarette burns. It looks like a bone that healed wrong because nobody took her to a doctor." The warmth in the voice cooled by several degrees. Not all the way, just enough to show what was underneath. It said, "Mr. Dalton, I have legal guardianship of that child. I have documentation from a sitting judge, and 2 licensed physicians. If you do not return her voluntarily, what happens next becomes significantly more complicated for you and significantly more expensive for everyone in that garage. Hank looked at the piece of paper in his chest pocket. He said, I will take that chance. He ended the call. He stood in the alley with the snow coming down on him. His hands were steady. His breathing was regular. There was something occurring in his chest that was not exactly calm, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of a man who had reached the point past which turning back was no longer a question being asked. 11 years ago, Hank Dalton had walked away from a room where someone needed him. The room had been smaller than this alley. The person had been smaller than Lily. She had been 8 years old with dark hair and their father's fists mapped across her face, and she had looked at Hank from inside the closet where she had been hiding. He had held her and told her it was going to be okay, and meant it with everything he had. Then the police came and she went into a system that was supposed to work, and he went into a juvenile facility that taught him things about the world that nothing should teach an 18-year-old. When he came out, she was gone, filed somewhere under a case number he never managed to trace. He had left after that, not physically, not right away, but the leaving had started there. Some part of him had crossed a line that night that he never fully came back from, because coming back required believing that staying mattered. And he had learned something about what happened to people who stayed. He went back inside. He sat down next to Lillian. She did not say anything, and neither did he. She eventually went back to sleep with one hand on the locket and the slow, careful breathing of a child who had been burning every resource she had for too long and finally felt safe enough to stop. Wes materialized next to him at 2 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without comment. They drank in silence. Wes said, he knew your name in 2 hours. Hank said yes. Wes said, that is not an amateur operation. Hank said no. Wes said, what do you want to do? Hank said, I want to make a phone call. He dialed at 2:17 in the morning. It rang 5 times. Then someone picked up. No greeting, just the sound of careful breathing, the breathing of a person who had learned to minimize every sound they made. Hank said, my name is Hank Dalton. I found a little girl tonight in a ditch off Highway 395. Her name is Lily. She gave me this number and told me to call it when she was safe. She is safe. A long silence. Then a voice, a woman's voice, low and rough in the way voices went after years of disuse. But underneath the roughness was something that had not been fully extinguished. Something that 3 years of isolation and heavy medication and a system designed to make her disappear had not managed to reach. It said, is my daughter alive? Hank said, yes, she is right here. She is going to be okay. Another silence. Longer, then the voice getting clearer with each word steadier, like someone finding their footing. After a long time on uncertain ground, I have been waiting for this call for 3 years. I knew it would come. I kept believing it would come. She stopped. Then is she hurt? Hank said she is hurt. She is going to be okay. The breathing on the other end changed, not softer, harder. The sound of someone pressing grief down into something functional, because they needed to be functional right now. The voice said, there is a safe deposit box, First Federal Bank, Spokane. Box 447, everything is in there. Before they came, I had almost all of it. I put it in the box because I knew they were coming, and I needed it to survive somewhere I could not be touched. Hank said, what is in it? The voice said, everything Raymond Steele does not want a court to see. Everything he has spent 3 years making sure nobody finds. She stopped. Then I was a forensic accountant. Before they took me, $40 million moving through his charitable foundations in patterns that only look like charity if you did not know what charity actually looked like. I found it. I documented it. I had the names of the people protecting him, the judge, the physicians, all of it. I was 2 weeks from taking it to the federal prosecutor when they came to my door. She breathed. She said what was done to me was not impulsive. Raymond Steele does not do anything impulsive. He had months to plan it. Every signature, every court document, every physician report. It was constructed. And the man who made it possible from the legal side is a federal judge named Harlan Ford, who has been on Steele's payroll for at least 6 years. Hank looked at Wes. Wes's expression had not changed, but his eyes had sharpened. Clara said, is Lily near you? Hank said yes. Clara said, do not let her hear this part. She does not need to carry this. Hank walked to the far corner of the garage past the motorcycles and the tool strips to where the noise of the space heater covered conversation. He said, "Go ahead." Clara said, "The box also has recordings. I used my phone to record 4 conversations, 2 with Steele, 1 with Ford, 1 with a physician named Marcus Webb, who agreed to sign my commitment papers in exchange for a board position at Steele's foundation. All 4 are on a USB drive in the box along with the financial documentation." She stopped. Then she said, "If you can get to that box, you can end him. Not put him in a corner, not negotiate. End him. Take everything he has built and take it apart in front of people who cannot look away." Hank said, "What is the box number again?" She said, 447, my mother's birthday, April 4th, 1947. Her voice had gone somewhere else for a second. Coming back from 3 years of being erased did not happen in a straight line. She said, "I need to tell you something about Lily." Hank said, "Tell me." She said, "She is the bravest person I have ever known. I told her to hold that number until she found someone who felt like safe. I told her she would know. I told her not to trust uniforms or suits or official voices. I told her to trust her gut." She stopped. She said, "She trusted you. That means something. To me, it means everything." He stood in the corner with the cold metal against his back and Lily sleeping on the table 30 feet away, and he held the phone and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am going to get you out of there." Clara said, "I know you are. I have known since the first ring." A sound on her end, a door. Footsteps approaching. She said quickly, "I have to go. They cannot find the phone. Call this number tomorrow night between midnight and 1. That is the window when the night orderly takes his break and the camera in my hall goes to a blind rotation." She paused. "Tell Lily I love her. Tell her I have been counting every day." The line went dead. Hank stood in the corner for a long moment. Then he walked back to the table where Lily slept and sat down on the stool next to her and put the piece of paper back in his chest pocket. He looked at the locket on her chest, rising and falling with her breathing. He thought about his sister. He thought about the closet. He thought about 11 years of road and nothing at the end of it. He thought about a forensic accountant in a locked room 43 miles north of here who had spent 3 years keeping her mind intact on faith alone. He reached out and very gently covered Lily's hand with his own. Just rested his scarred, oil-stained fingers over her small ones. She stirred slightly and did not wake. Her breathing steadied. Outside, the storm continued. It would go all night. But in the garage, the heater hummed and the girl breathed, and Hank Dalton, who had been very good at leaving for 11 years, sat still and kept watch and did not move until morning. The morning after Christmas came in gray and cold and without ceremony. Hank had not slept. He had sat next to Lily through the dark hours and watched the space heater cycle on and off and listened to her breathing even out into something that sounded less like survival and more like rest. Somewhere around 5 in the morning, he had allowed himself to close his eyes for 20 minutes. That was all. 20 minutes, and then he was back watching the door, watching the girl, watching the slow progress of a night that needed to be over before the next thing could begin. May changed the IV bag at 6, checked temperature, checked pulse, said without inflection that the numbers were moving in the right direction. She noted the fracture in the forearm was old enough that it did not require emergency intervention, but would need proper setting within the week. She said all of this the way she said everything, which was clinically and without drama, because May Holden had learned long ago that feelings were not useful at the table and could be had later in private, which was what she did. Wes had gone home for 3 hours and come back at dawn. Knox and Finn had rotated out and 2 other Iron Saints had come in. Sadie Cobb arrived at first light with a duffel bag and the demeanor of someone who had been briefed and did not require further explanation. Sadie was 33 years old, former military police with dark hair and a tight braid, and the kind of situational awareness that made her the most dangerous person in any room that did not already contain someone who had done 2 tours in a combat zone. She had been with the Iron Saints for 4 years, and she had Wes's complete trust, which was not easy to earn. She set the duffel down and looked at Lily and looked at Hank and said, "What do you need me to do?" Not a question, a statement waiting for direction. Hank said, "Stay with her. Nobody she does not know comes through that door." Sadie said, "Understood." She pulled a stool to the side of the table, and that was the end of the conversation. Hank went to the back corridor and called Finn. He needed everything available on Cascade Ridge Behavioral Institute. Staffing patterns, shift changes, security setup, access points. Finn said he would make some calls. By mid-morning, Finn had returned with what they needed. Private facility licensed under a special classification not reviewed in 4 years. No state inspections on record. Security ran to 6 guards during day shift and 3 overnight. Staff rotation for the overnight shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, with 2 orderlies and 1 floor nurse. At approximately 12:30, the overnight nurse took a 45-minute break in the staff room on the ground floor, during which the camera coverage on the 3rd floor ran on a rotation cycle that created a 14-minute blind window in the northeast corridor. The northeast corridor, according to the facility map that one of Finn's contacts had produced, was where the long-term isolation rooms were located. Finn said, "We need someone on the inside." He paused. "There is a man named Virgil Ames. He worked at Cascade Ridge as an orderly for 3 years. He left 8 months ago under circumstances that were not entirely voluntary. He took a call from me 2 years back that I am not going to explain further. I believe he can get us onto the floor." Wes said, "Can you trust him?" Finn said, "I trust him to want to settle the debt, which is not the same thing, but it will work." Wes looked at Hank. Hank said, "Set it up, tonight during the window." The day passed slowly, the way days did when you were waiting for night. Lily slept again in the afternoon, which May said was what she needed, and Sadie sat next to her and read from a paperback she had brought, and the garage held its quiet vigil against the storm outside that had lessened to steady snowfall, but had not stopped. Hank went outside once to stand in the alley and think through the facility layout. He ran it twice mentally, looking for failure points. Then he went back inside because standing alone in alleys was something he had done enough of, and it served its purpose in 1 pass, not 3. Wes found him near the workbench. He said, "You doing all right?" Hank said, "I am working through the facility." Wes said, "I know." He paused. "You know what I see when I look at you right now?" Hank said, "You are going to tell me anyway." Wes said, "I see a man who has found his reason. That is a powerful thing. It is also a dangerous thing if it makes you stop thinking and start feeling." Hank said, "I am thinking clearly." Wes said, "You are thinking like a man who has a sister-shaped hole in his chest and just found a child-shaped reason to fill it. That is not the same as thinking clearly." Hank looked at him. Wes said, "I am not telling you to stop. I am telling you to be aware of it. There is a difference between a mission and a debt. Missions you can plan, debts make you reckless." He went back to his stool by the wall. Hank stood at the workbench and let the words settle. Wes was right, they both knew it, and being right about it did not change what needed to happen. It just meant Hank needed to be sharper about the difference between what he wanted to do and what the situation required. At 11:45 that night, Hank and May met Virgil Ames in the parking lot of a gas station 2 miles from Cascade Ridge. Virgil was 40 years old and looked older. Medium height, carrying the slight stoop of a man who had spent years apologizing for his own presence. He had the eyes of someone who had made a calculation months ago that he was still paying for and knew it. He shook Hank's hand without holding the grip long and said, "I can get you onto the floor. I still have the key card from my last week. They never deactivated it." Hank looked at him. He said, "How well do you know the facility?" Virgil said, "Well enough. 3 years on the overnight rotation." He stopped. "The woman you are looking for is in room 314, 3rd floor northeast end. She has been in isolation for most of the last year." May checked her bag, warm saline stimulant medication to counteract sedatives, portable vitals monitor blankets, everything for an extraction of someone who had been on heavy psychiatric medication for 3 years. They went in at 12:20. Cascade Ridge at night was a building that believed in its own legitimacy too completely. The cameras were there, but the response protocols between them had grown complacent the way institutions became complacent when nothing bad had happened for long enough. Virgil's keycard opened the side service door without hesitation. The 3 of them moved up the stairwell to the 3rd floor, not running, walking with the deliberate pace of people who belonged there until they no longer did. The northeast corridor was exactly as the map had described it. Long, fluorescent lights on low overnight setting. Numbered doors on both sides. Small windows in each. Room 314. Virgil used the key card. The lock released. Hank went in first. The room was small in the way that made a man's jaw tighten. A bed, a narrow window admitting nothing but the reflection of a parking lot light, a toilet, a chair, no books, no personal items, no evidence that the person who lived here was a person rather than a problem to be managed. Clara Donovan was sitting on the edge of the bed, not lying down, not medicated into stillness, sitting upright facing the door with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the door as though she had known exactly when it would open. Later, he would understand that she had heard the footsteps in the hall and recognized that they were wrong. Not the regular soft shuffle of overnight staff, but something with more purpose, and she had sat up and faced what was coming either way. She was 38 years old and looked both older and younger than that simultaneously. Thin in the way people became thin when their body was being managed rather than nourished. Hair gone gray at the temples, too early. The bones of her face more prominent than they should have been. But her eyes were clear. Not fully clear in the way of a person who had never been medicated. There was a faint residual fog at the edges, but the center of them was sharp and present and had been maintained by an act of sustained will over 3 years of chemical pressure. She looked at Hank. She said, "You are the one who found her." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is she safe right now?" He said, "She is with people I trust." Clara nodded once. She stood up, and for a moment her legs did not fully cooperate, 3 years of limited movement making themselves known, but she steadied herself against the bed frame and stood. She said, "I learned to reduce the medication." Not eliminate it, reduce. I found that if I held the tablet under the back of my tongue against the tissue and pressed with my tongue from the other side, I could get through about 60% of it and retain enough cognition to think clearly. She paused. It took 4 months to work out the geometry. May was already moving, taking Clara's pulse, beginning the quiet, rapid assessment of someone who needed to know what she was working with. Clara let her work. She looked at Hank and said, "The box is at First Federal Bank on Riverside Avenue, box 447. The key is at a secondary location. There is a small magnetic case attached to the underside of the bench at Riverside Park, the one nearest the East Fountain." She paused. "I need you to understand something about what is in that box." He said, "Tell me, tell." She said, "Raymond Steele has been moving money through a network of charitable foundations for 9 years. The total across the period I documented is just over $40 million. The money comes from investors who believe they are funding legitimate social programs. It does not go to those programs. It goes through shell entities to accounts he controls personally. The foundations exist entirely on paper and on Steele's public reputation, which he constructed specifically for this purpose." She stopped while May checked her blood pressure. She continued, "Judge Harlan Ford has been enabling this for at least 6 years. He has signed court orders, commitment papers, and custody modifications on Steele's behalf in exchange for payments routed through one of the shell entities as consulting fees. 43 payments over 5 years. All documented, all on the drive." Hank said, "And the recordings." Clara said, 4 conversations. 2 with Steele, 1 with Ford, 1 with Dr. Marcus Webb, who certified my psychiatric condition and signed the commitment papers. The conversation with Webb is the clearest. He mentions the board position in the fee structure explicitly. He did not know I was recording. I used a recording app that stored files to a cloud backup automatically. When they took my phone, they assumed the files were gone. They were not. A sound in the corridor. All 3 of them went still. Footsteps. The circuit of someone doing routine checks. The footsteps went past the door. Did not stop. They waited 10 seconds. May said quietly, "We need to move." Getting Clara down 3 flights of stairs was slower than going up. Her legs were not fully reliable, and Hank stayed close on her left side, not holding her up, but present enough that she could correct against him if she needed to. She did not ask for help. She accepted proximity. They were through the service door and across the parking lot when the alarm sounded. A tone audible from outside 60 seconds after they cleared the building. Camera anomaly, door sensor, someone who took it seriously. Hank got Clara into the back of May's vehicle. May drove. Virgil went a different direction as arranged. They drove south toward the city. Clara sat in the back and looked out the window at dark trees going past. She did not cry. She breathed in the deliberate way of someone taking stock of air, reminding herself of what it meant to be outside. After several minutes, she said, "How is she?" "Really," Hank said, "she has injuries that are documented. She is eating, she is talking. She is stronger than she has any right to be." Clara said, "She gets that from her father's side." He looked at her. She said, "He passed when she was 2. He was a strong man." She looked back out the window. "She gets the stubborn from me." They drove the rest of the way in silence. The salvage yard on the east end of the city was Wes's secondary property. 15 acres of stacked vehicles and corrugated metal buildings surrounded by chain link topped with razor wire. 3 German shepherds patrolled the inside perimeter. Open ground on 3 sides meant anyone approaching could be seen from the main building with enough time to respond. They arrived at 1:40 in the morning. Sadie met them at the gate with the Mays healed and quiet. She took one look at Clara and said, "May, the back room is set up." May nodded and took Clara inside for a proper examination. Hank went to where Lily was. She was in the small interior office on a cot awake because she had not been able to sleep. She was sitting up with the blanket around her shoulders and the locket in her hand. She looked at Hank when he came in. He said, "She is here." Lily stared at him. "He said she is in the back room with May right now. She needs a little time, but she is here. She is okay." Lily did not move for a moment. She was very still in the particular way of someone who had waited so long for something that the arrival of it required a moment to become real. Then she got off the cot. Hank walked with her to the back room. He knocked. May opened the door. Behind her, Claire was sitting on the exam table with the blanket around her shoulders and her eyes on the door. The moment Lily came through the door, Clara's composure broke. Not loudly. Quietly, the way things broke when they had been held together by will alone for too long. She slid off the table and went to her knees on the concrete floor and opened her arms, and Lily ran the last 3 steps, and they held each other without saying anything. The room went quiet. May stepped back. Hank stood in the doorway. Wes, who had come in behind Hank, stopped and did not move. Knox turned and faced the wall, not dramatically, just turned. Nobody said anything for a long time. The only sound was a mother and her daughter breathing the same air for the first time in 3 years. Hank watched it. He let himself watch it fully and completely without looking away, because some things deserve to be witnessed without flinching, and this was one of them. After a while, Lily pulled back just far enough to look at her mother's face. She touched Clara's cheek with her small hand. She said, "You got old." Clara laughed. It was a broken, unpracticed sound, the laugh of someone who had not done it in a long time. She pulled Lily back in and held her tighter. Hank stepped back out of the doorway. He stood in the main building for a moment. Then he went outside and looked up at the sky, which had finally cleared, and the stars over eastern Washington were out in the dense profusion they produced when the clouds were gone. He heard the door. Wes came out and stood next to him. He lit a cigarette and looked at the stars and did not say anything for a while. Then Wes said, "You did good tonight." Hank said May did the medical work. Wes said May did the medical work. "You did the rest." He paused. "Do not minimize it." Hank did not say anything. Wes said, "What happens in the morning?" Hank said, "We get to the bank, get the drive. Then we find someone with credentials to handle what comes after." Wes said, "I have an FBI agent. Her name is Deanna Cross. She has worked Spokane for 6 years. She is known to be difficult for the wrong people. My contact says she is the kind of person who followed the law until the law stopped being the right direction and then kept going straight." Hank said, "Set up the meeting." Wes nodded and went back inside. Hank stayed out a few minutes longer. He was running the variables he had been running since the previous night. Raymond Steele had known his name and his location within 2 hours of finding Lily. That required either significant surveillance infrastructure or an informant. He had been doing the math on this since Steele's phone call, and he had arrived at the same answer each time. He went back inside and found Finn. He said, "When did you first contact Virgil about tonight?" Finn said, "Yesterday afternoon, around 3. Hank said, "And Steele called me around 11. He knew the garage location." Finn looked at him. Hank said, "It is not an accusation. It is math." Finn was quiet. Then he said, "I will find out." He found out in 40 minutes. He came back with controlled fury held in a very narrow space. He said Virgil took a payment from Steele 6 months ago. $10,000 routed through a shell company. Background information on former Cascade Ridge employees. Virgil told himself it was harmless. He did not know it would come to a child in a ditch. Hank said, "Where is he now?" Finn said, "I can have him here in an hour." Hank thought about what anger wanted and what the situation required, and whether they were aligned, which they were not. Virgil was frightened and guilty and had not known the full scope of what he was involved in. Those things made him dangerous as an enemy and potentially useful as something else. He said, "Bring him in." Virgil arrived at 3 in the morning looking like a man who had been awake for 2 days and knew why. He stood in the main building and looked at Hank and did not try to explain. Hank said, "You gave Steele information." Virgil said, "Yes." Hank said, "Did you know there was a child involved?" Virgil said, "I knew he had a ward. I did not know the circumstances. I told myself I did not want to know." Hank said, "You are right that it is insufficient." He paused. "You are also the only person in this room with 3 years of detailed knowledge of that facility, its personnel, and its documentation practices, which means you have a choice." Virgil said, "What choice?" Hank said, "You walk out of this yard and take your chances. Or you help us make sure that facility never operates again and that Raymond Steele goes to prison with evidence no lawyer he can hire changes. And in exchange, I tell the people who matter that you cooperated fully from the point you were given the choice." Virgil looked at the floor. Then he said, "What do you need?" Hank said, "Everything you know about how that facility documents its patients. Every name of every physician who signed paperwork for long-term residents. Every external contact you are aware of. Written down. Tonight." Virgil nodded. Finn took him to a table in the corner with a pad of paper and a pen. The sun came up at 7:42. Clara was in the back room having slept 3 hours and woken more coherent than the previous night. Lily had slept next to her on a cot that Sadie had put together, one hand on her mother's arm, and May had let her sleep there because the medicine of it was more valuable than anything in her bag. Sadie sat through the night in the outer room with the door open, not because anyone asked her to, but because it was where she needed to be, and that was how Sadie operated. At 8:30, Wes brought Deanna Cross into the main building. She was 44 years old, 12 years in the FBI, the last 6 in the Spokane field office. Compact and direct with the kind of eyes that had heard a large number of lies and retained the ability to recognize them on contact. She looked at Hank and then around the salvage yard at the Iron Saints positioned around the space at the general geography of an operation that was not exactly within the law, but was clearly pointed towards something. She said, "Wes tells me you have a situation." Hank said, "I have a 7-year-old girl with cigarette burns on her shoulders and 3 years of evidence against the man who put them there." He paused. "And a forensic accountant who documented $40 million of fraud before she was illegally committed to a private psychiatric facility by a federal judge on his payroll." Cross looked at him. She said, "That is a significant claim." Hank said, "There is a safe deposit box at First Federal Bank with a USB drive that makes it considerably more than a claim." Something shifted in her expression. Small but present. She said, "Who signed the custody order?" He said, "Judge Harlan Ford." A fast movement behind her eyes. Gone before it fully formed. She said, "Ford signed the commitment order as well." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have been trying to open an inquiry into Ford's financial activities for 14 months. Every time I have gotten close, something from above my position has closed the access." She paused. 14 months, Hank said. "What happened when it got closed?" She said, "I was told the inquiry lacked sufficient predicate. Twice by 2 different supervisors. The second supervisor received a significant bonus 4 months after telling me that." Hank said, "There is a recording on the drive of Ford and Steele discussing payments. Specific, dated, named." Cross was quiet. Then she said, "I need to see what is in that box before I can promise anything. But I am here, and 14 months of doors being closed is a long time to wait for one to open." Hank said, "The bank opens at 9. She looked at her watch. She said, "Then we have 20 minutes. Outside the salvage yard on the road running along the western fence line, a black SUV with tinted windows had been parked since 6:45 in the morning. It had not moved. It was doing exactly what it needed to do. None of them had noticed it yet. First Federal Bank on Riverside Avenue opened at 9 on the 26th of December. With reduced staff and the subdued energy of a business that would rather have been closed but understood its obligations. Hank and Cross walked in together. The bank manager was a man in his 50s with the careful demeanor of someone who had learned that Christmas week brought unusual requests and that arguing with a federal badge was not in his job description. Cross showed her credentials, said she needed access to a safe deposit box under emergency evidentiary authorization. He looked at the badge. He decided not to ask about Hank and led them to the vault. Box 447. Sadie had retrieved the key at 7 that morning from the magnetic case under the park bench, exactly where Clara had described it. The manager inserted the master key. Cross inserted the secondary. The lock turned. Inside was a USB drive in a sealed plastic evidence bag. The bag was labeled in Clara's precise handwriting with the date, the contents description, and a chain of custody notation that began with her name and ended with the words, "For whoever opens this after me." There was also a handwritten index, 2 pages, every file on the drive with a one-sentence description and the date it was created. It was the document of someone who understood how evidence worked and had prepared accordingly. Cross read the index standing at the vault table. She did not speak while she read. Hank watched her face, the professional surface, the thing moving under it, the moment it broke through. She looked up from the page. She said she had all of this before they took her. Hank said, she built it over 8 months. She was 2 weeks from the prosecutor's office when Steele moved on her. Cross looked back at the index. She said there are 43 payments to Ford listed here, all documented, all on the drive. Hank said the recording with Webb is the clearest. He discusses the board position and the fee structure explicitly. He did not know she was recording. Cross was quiet for the moment. She said, I need to get this to the field office immediately. I need to make copies before anything else happens and get them to 3 separate locations. Because if Steele has the kind of reach that closed 14 months of inquiries from inside the Bureau, I need this distributed before anyone above my clearance level knows I have it. She made 4 copies at a print shop 3 miles away using a burner laptop she produced from her bag. She sent encrypted files to 3 separate contacts outside the state. She made 2 phone calls outside in the cold with her back to the building and her voice low. When she came back, she said, it is distributed. 3 other copies in the hands of people who know what to do with them. She looked at Hank. She said, now we need to move on to Ford. He said, yes. She said, Ford is a sitting federal judge. I cannot just walk into his house. Hank said, you can walk into his house with what is on that drive. He paused. I want to be in front of him before he hears about Cascade Ridge and starts calculating his options. Once he starts calculating, he starts covering. We move now. Cross was quiet. Then she nodded once. They drove to Ford's house in Cross's vehicle. The Iron Saints formed up behind them, 6 bikes and a second vehicle. Nobody had been asked to come. They had simply come. Ford lived in the residential hills west of the city, a house built by someone who had acquired rather than inherited. Gated drive, security camera at the entrance, 3 vehicles in the circular front, lights on in the upper floor. Cross stopped at the gate and pressed the intercom. She identified herself and gave her badge number and said she needed to speak with Judge Ford on a matter of federal significance. The gate opened. They drove up to the front. The Iron Saints parked at the base of the drive in a line visible from the front windows. Presence was the message. Ford answered the door himself. 65 years old, silver-haired, wearing a wool robe over dress clothes, which told Hank he had not been sleeping. Ford looked at Cross, looked at Hank, looked past them at the line of motorcycles at the base of his drive. Cross said, Judge Ford, I apologize for the early hour. I have some questions about your professional relationship with Raymond Steele. Ford said I would need my attorney present for any such conversation. Cross said, you are not under arrest, and this is not a custodial interrogation. You are entirely free to decline. She paused. I would note that I have a USB drive in my possession containing financial documentation and audio recordings that my colleagues are currently reviewing. What you choose to do in the next 10 minutes will have a significant effect on how the subsequent process unfolds. Ford looked at the drive in her hand. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had spent years ensuring would never exist and was now looking at anyway. He said, come in. They sat in his study, dark wood, books selected for their appearance, a desk that had seen a significant number of decisions, not all of them legal. Cross was precise and calm. She laid out what was documented in the tone she might have used to describe weather patterns. Ford listened and said nothing. His hands were flat on the desk surface and stayed flat. When she played 30 seconds of the audio recording of his own voice discussing payment, routing with steel, his hands stopped being flat and he pressed them together. He said, "What is it that you want?" Cross said, "Every name in the network, everyone connected to Raymond Steele's operation who has received payment or provided services in exchange for that payment. The physicians, the administrators, the staff at Cascade Ridge who were aware of the nature of the facility. Every name." Ford was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There are 27 people." Cross said, "Start from the beginning." It took 43 minutes. Ford talked the way men talked when the weight of something became heavier than their ability to carry it. Names, roles, payment structures, the specific mechanics of how he had made wrong things look procedurally correct. Dr. Marcus Webb, who had certified Clara's condition and signed her commitment papers in exchange for a board position, paying $80,000 annually. Two administrators at Cascade Ridge, who had maintained the isolation protocols and restricted Clara's contact with the outside world. A county social worker who had closed Lily's welfare file without investigation following a single conversation with Steele. A senator's aide receiving payments routed through a shell company who had used that position to close federal inquiry pathways. The same pathways that had stopped Deanna Cross 14 months ago. 27 names. Cross recorded everything on 2 devices simultaneously. Hank sat against the far wall and said nothing. His job in this room was to be present and to be the physical fact of consequences, and he did that without moving. When Ford finished, Cross stood and said, "One more matter." She looked at her notes. "Dr. Marcus Webb, you said he retained documentation." Ford nodded slowly. He said Webb kept copies of everything. Insurance, he called it, including the original psychiatric assessment files for Clara Donovan. The real ones, before he altered them. Cross said the originals. Ford said he was afraid of Steele. He kept the originals in case Steele ever tried to make Webb the sole responsible party. He said the originals proved Clara was completely competent when she was committed. Hank looked at Cross. The same evidence that had been constructed to destroy Clara had been preserved in its original form by the very man who had falsified it. Webb had kept the proof of Clara's sanity as a personal protection against the man who had paid him to declare her insane. The architecture of the conspiracy had built its own undoing into itself. Cross made a call before they left Ford's house. She reached Webb directly. She identified herself. She told him what Ford had said about the original documentation. She told him she was coming to his home in 90 minutes and that the individual who provided the most complete cooperation earliest would receive a different level of prosecutorial attention than those who did not. Webb agreed to cooperate before she finished the sentence. Cross stepped out of the study. She came back 2 minutes later and said, "I have agents en route to Steele's residence." She paused. "He is not there. Housekeeper says he left 40 minutes ago with luggage." Hank was on his feet before she finished. He looked at his watch. He said the private aviation terminal south of the city. Ford mentioned it. Cross said minimum 25 minutes for federal response. Jurisdictional step outside city limits. Hank did the math. He said, "We can be there in 15. Cross looked at him. She said, "If you get there before we do and something happens, every piece of evidence we have collected becomes complicated by association." He looked at her steadily. She said, "I know what you are going to do. I am not telling you to stop. I am telling you, do not let something happen that I cannot explain in a report." He said, "Understood." He went out the front door. The 13 Iron Saints were mounted before Hank reached his Harley. Nobody spoke. The engine started and they went south, pushing the bikes hard on the county road well past the posted limit, with the cold morning air hammering at exposed skin and the engine sounds bleeding together into a single sustained roar. The private aviation terminal was 18 miles south of the city on a county road between flat farmland and frozen river bottom. A single runway, a half-dozen hangars, a gate designed to stop vehicles, not motorcycles. The terminal appeared ahead. Chain-link gate across the access road. A guard shack. And beyond both of them on the single tarmac apron in front of the main hangar, a white private jet with its engines running. Raymond Steele was at the base of the boarding stairs, dressed for travel, carry-on bag, dark coat. He was looking at the approaching motorcycles with the stillness of a man whose plan had been proceeding correctly until 30 seconds ago. The gate was not built for what happened next. Hank took it at speed with the front wheel lifting slightly and the rear coming through the gap where the lock had been. The other bikes followed in fast succession. The guard in the shack looked at 13 Harley-Davidson motorcycles crossing his gate and made the professionally correct decision to step back inside. They fanned out across the tarmac, engines down, silence except for the jet turbines at their steady pitch. Steele stood at the base of the stairs and looked at the semicircle of iron saints and did not move. He was 52 years old and he had spent those years building layers of insulation between himself and consequences. He had lawyers and judges and politicians and the architecture of a legal persona so carefully constructed that most people who encountered it never thought to look at what was underneath. He had never been on an airstrip at sunrise with 13 men who were not interested in his legal persona. Hank walked toward him. He walked at the pace of someone who was not in a hurry because hurrying was for people who were uncertain about the outcome. Steele reached into his coat pocket. Every iron saint within eyeline shifted. Steele produced his phone. He held it up so Hank could see the screen. On the screen was a live video feed, the interior of the salvage yard office, the small room where Lily and Clara were. In the corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure standing near the far wall. Steele said, "I want you to look at that carefully. One phone call. Walk away from this tarmac and take your people with you, and the man in that room walks out and nobody is hurt." His voice carried the controlled warmth of a man who had rehearsed this, a man who had located a point of vulnerability and aimed at it precisely. Hank looked at the screen. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Then he looked at Steele. He said, "Hold on." He raised his phone to his ear. One ring. Sadie Cobb picked up. He said, "Status." Her voice came back flat and immediate. She said, "Handled." He came over the south fence at 6:48. He is zip-tied in the hallway. Lily is fine. Clara is fine. Hank said, "How long ago?" Sadie said, 11 minutes. Hank lowered the phone. He looked at Steele. He said, "Your man in that room has been on the floor for 11 minutes. He paused. "You activated a contingency that was already finished before you played it." Something happened to Steele's face. Not all at once. By degrees. The composure still present at the surface, but underneath it, the architecture beginning to shift. A man who had spent 30 years building a particular kind of certainty, discovering that certainty had a floor, and he had just found it. He looked at the phone. He looked at Hank. He looked at the line of men. He looked at the jet. Hank watched him calculate. A man like Raymond Steele did not panic, and he did not run. A man like Raymond Steele understood the geometry of a situation and accepted it when the geometry became irrefutable. He had built his life on understanding when a position was untenable and accepting that fact before the people around him did. Steele lowered the phone slowly. He looked at Hank for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man who had played every angle available to him and had arrived at the end of them. Not afraid, not remorseful, just finished. He stood at the base of the stairs with his carry-on bag and his expensive coat, and he waited for what came next with the same composure he had brought to every other situation in his life, because it was the only thing he had left that was entirely his own. Hank walked to him. He said, "Dying would have been easier for you, I understand that. But that little girl deserves to sit in a courtroom and watch you answer for every single thing you did. Every day of those 3 years, that is what justice looks like." Steele looked at him and said nothing. Hank said, "Somebody turn that jet off." Knox walked to the stairs, spoke briefly to the crew through the open door, and the turbines began to wind down. 3 minutes later, 2 FBI vehicles came through the broken gate. Deanna Cross stepped out of the lead vehicle. She looked at Steele. She looked at Hank. She looked at the 13 Iron Saints standing in a semicircle on a private airstrip in the early morning light of December 26th, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she walked to Steele, produced her credentials, and began reading him his rights in the level professional voice of someone who had been waiting 14 months for this particular morning. The next 72 hours moved at the pace of institutional processes that had been set in motion and could not be stopped. Cross worked out of her field office with the colleagues she trusted, routing everything through channels that were clean. Warrants were issued, arrests were made. 27 names became 27 cases. Marcus Webb, the physician who had certified Clara's condition, was arrested at his home on the afternoon of December 27th. He had the original documentation ready when the agents arrived. Clara's real psychiatric assessment, the one that showed a completely competent woman with no history of mental illness, no evidence of psychosis, no clinical basis for involuntary commitment. The one Webb had falsified and then kept in a drawer for 3 years as insurance against the man who had paid him to do it. The document took 30 seconds to read and unmade 3 years of constructed lies in the reading of it. The two Cascade Ridge administrators were picked up within hours of each other on the same afternoon. The facility was placed under emergency state supervision. The patients inside, all 23 of them, were evaluated by independent psychiatric professionals over the following week. 11 were found to have been involuntarily committed without legitimate clinical basis. The senator's aide resigned before the arrest warrant was issued, which was the kind of calculation people in his position made and which did not change the outcome. Ford was charged with 7 counts of judicial corruption, conspiracy, and fraud. His bail application was denied by a colleague selected specifically for never having owed Ford anything. Raymond Steele was held without bail. His legal team, 4 of them, arrived within 3 hours of his arrest and began building walls. Cross had anticipated this. The evidence was already distributed, already in the hands of people outside the reach of anything Steele's lawyers could construct. The walls they built were walls around a foundation that no longer existed. Hank was not present for most of this. He watched it from a distance in the way a man watched something he had set in motion but that no longer required his hand on it. He was at the salvage yard when it mattered. Clara had been moved to a small, secure apartment, temporary housing, while the legal proceedings organized themselves, and she was there with Lily and May checking in twice daily and the slow business of a life beginning to reconstruct itself from 3 years of someone else's administration. Clara sat at a table with papers in the evenings, the documents of financial accounts being unfrozen legal status, being restored, the machinery of a life reasserting itself one form at a time. Sadie came by in the afternoons not because anyone asked her to, but because she had decided it was where she needed to be. She did not say Mom. She sat with Lily and let Lily show her things, a drawing, a book, a description of the library book that had taught her about hiding things and locket backings. Sadie listened to all of it with the attentiveness of someone who understood that being listened to was not a small thing. Lily came to Hank on the afternoon of the 27th at the salvage yard. She walked across the yard with her splinted arm against her side and her good hand in her jacket pocket, and she came to where he was sitting on an overturned crate near the fence. She sat down next to him without asking if she could. He said, "How is your arm?" She said, "May says it needs surgery. She says it will be fine after." She paused. She says, "I have been very tough about it," which she says is good, but also worrying. He said, "Both things can be true." She said, "That is what Clara says too." She looked at the yard for a moment. The guard dogs were lying in a patch of weak December sunlight near the far fence. The sky had gone from gray to a pale washed blue. She said, "We are going to have to leave. Clara says we need to stay somewhere safe while the legal things happen. She says it could take a long time." He said, "It will take some time." "Yes." She said, "Will you come and see us?" He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "You always say yes." He said, "I always mean it." She looked at him with the direct appraisal that she had applied to him from the first night, the look that measured something he did not fully understand but had learned to sit still under. She said, "I made you something." She reached into her jacket pocket with her good hand and produced a small object wrapped in a piece of torn notebook paper. She held it out. He took it. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a star, small, made from a piece of wire bent into 5 points with the patient imprecision of something that had taken several attempts. The wire had been wrapped with something silver, a gum wrapper pressed tight to give it a metallic shine. It was crooked and slightly uneven, and it was unmistakably a star. There was a note with it, written on the inside of the notebook paper in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who was teaching herself to make her letters mean something. He read it. It said, "Heroes are supposed to get happy endings. You are mine. Come back soon. Lily." He held the star in his palm and looked at it. He did not say anything for a moment because there was the thing happening behind his sternum again, and it was larger this time than it had been before, and he did not have a name for it still, but he had stopped needing one. He said, "I am going to keep this with me." She said, "I know." She got up and went back across the yard toward the office. At the door, she turned and looked back at him once, then she went inside. He sat with the star in his palm. He thought about his sister. He thought about the closet and the blood and the system that had swallowed her and never given her back. He thought about the 11 years of road built on the specific foundation of that night, the belief that staying was a risk that cost more than he could afford. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who had kept a phone number for 3 years on faith alone and had handed it to him because he felt like safe. Wes came out of the main building and walked across the yard and stood next to him. He looked at the star in Hank's palm. He did not say anything about it. He lit a cigarette and looked at the pale winter sky. He said, "We are holding church tomorrow night. Full chapter. There is a vote scheduled." Hank said, "About what?" Wes said, "About you." He paused. "You have worn the patch for 8 years without patching in formally. You have ridden with us and worked with us and bled with us. You have been something that does not have a clean name because you would not let it be named." He looked at Hank. "That changes tomorrow night if you say yes." Hank looked at the star. He said, "I will be there." Wes nodded. He finished his cigarette and went back inside. Church was held the following night. 23 men in a room built for exactly this purpose. Leather cuts, road dirt, cigarette smoke thick as weather. The Iron Saints arranged around the long table in the order they always arranged themselves, by tenure and by role, and by the particular gravity each man carried. Wes stood at the head. He said what needed to be said without ornamentation. That Hank Dalton had ridden with them for 8 years. That he had done in the last 4 days what the entire chapter had not been able to do for a long time, which was remind them what they were actually for. That the vote was a formality, because the answer was already known by everyone in the room and had been for some time. He said, "All in favor." Every hand went up, not with drama, not with ceremony, just hands going up around a table because the thing was true and needed to be acknowledged, and that was what the vote was for. Wes looked at Hank. He said, "Welcome home, Hank." The room was quiet for one moment that held more in it than most rooms held in years. Then someone opened a cooler and the night became what those nights became, which was the particular warmth of men who had chosen each other in the full knowledge of what choosing each other meant. Hank stayed until late. He did not talk much, which was normal, but he was present in a way that was different from how he had been present in this room before. Not watching from the edges, not calculating the exit, just there among brothers, which was a thing he had been in practice, but not in fact for 8 years and was now in fact as well. He went outside when the night was late and the room had gone to the comfortable quiet of men running out of things that needed saying. He walked to his Harley. He sat on it for a moment, key in hand, the engine cold, the salvage yard quiet around him. Through the window of the main building, he could see the faint warm light of inside the yellow of a room where people were. The road was out there. He knew exactly what it felt like, exactly what it asked of him, which was nothing, exactly what it gave back, which was the same. He put the key in, the engine started. He sat with it idling, the familiar vibration through his hands and his legs and his chest, the sound that had been his company through more miles than he had ever counted. He looked at the gate. He looked at the star attached to the zipper of his jacket, with a piece of wire hanging there in the cold air, catching what light there was. He thought about Lily saying, "Come back soon." He thought about what it meant that he wanted to. He turned the bars. He rode to the gate, went in through it, and turned left. Toward the city, toward the lights, toward the narrow street and the modest building where Clara sat at the table with her papers and Lily slept in the next room with the locket on the nightstand. He was not invited. He did not need to be. Some directions were right ones and you did not need an invitation to ride them. You needed only to decide that you were no longer the kind of man who confused leaving with freedom. He rode through the city in the late night cold. Not fast, the way a man rode when he knew where he was going and was not in a hurry to prove it. He found the building, parked, sat for a moment with the engine ticking down into silence. He got off. He walked to the door. He knocked. Clara opened in. She had been up with the papers the way she was most evenings, now rebuilding the architecture of a life that had been systematically dismantled. She looked at him. She looked at the star on his jacket zipper. She stepped back and opened the door wider. He went inside. The room was warm. It smelled like coffee and the specific domestic smell of people making a space their own for the first time. Clara went back to the table and her papers, which was what she did because the work of reconstruction did not pause for sentiment. He sat down across from her. They did not say very much. That was all right. Some rooms did not require words to be inhabited properly. After a while, a small sound came from the hallway. Bare feet on the floor. Lily appeared in the doorway in the oversized shirt she was using as pajamas, her splinted arm against her side, and her hair at the particular angle of someone who had been asleep for several hours. She looked at Hank, sitting at the table. She said, "You came back," he said. "Told you I would." She considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. Then she crossed the room and climbed into the chair next to him and put her splinted arm on the table and looked at him with the look that said she had things to tell him and was deciding where to begin. Clara watched them from across the table. She looked at her daughter, who was already explaining something about a book she had found in the apartment that she was pretty sure was going to be one of her 3 favorites, and at the man across from her, who was listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that what was being said mattered. She looked at this, and she did not say anything. Outside, the city continued its business, indifferent and ongoing. The highway was out there in the dark. It would always be out there. The road that led everywhere and required nothing. But Hank Dalton sat at a small table in a warm room and listened to a 7-year-old girl explain her literary preferences, and the road could wait, and he was exactly where he had finally decided to be, which was somewhere that needed him to stay. He had spent 11 years getting good at leaving. It turned out coming back was the harder road, and the only one worth riding.